Well, greetings and welcome to Simply Christ. Glad that you are here. Please hit the subscribe button and leave a comment. I would greatly appreciate it. If there is any topic that causes division in the church, it's over the issue of worship. What are we supposed to do in a worship service? What's involved in a worship service? What can you or what you can't do? What are the different styles? Which is the correct style? What is a worship service in the first place? Well, today I interview a guest who's going to clear that up. And we're going to find out that maybe we've had all this whole idea of worship wrong in the first place.
Well, we want to welcome Tom Wadsworth to the show. Tom, you have quite the pedigree. Harding University graduate, a degree in biblical studies and a minor in Greek, 3 years at the seminary at Harding School of Theology in Memphis with a master's degree in divinity. Finally, a PhD in New Testament at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, raised Lutheran, then became a member of the Churches of Christ, and eventually a pulpit minister in the Churches of Christ. So you've had quite a stellar career in investigating the Bible, investigating scriptures. And then one day as a pulpit minister, you were reading Corinthians chapter 14, and you had quite the revelation, didn't you?
Yeah, Mark, it was 1 Corinthians 14 that blew my mind and got me going. And back in 1977, almost 50 years ago now, and I was in my first year of preaching, and I'd been taking 1 Corinthians one chapter at a time, preaching through it, and I was in the 14th week, and I was coming up on 1 Corinthians 14, tempted to skip over it because it deals with speaking in tongues. And if you remember the Church of Christ environment back in the 70s, speaking in tongues was a very volatile topic and a divisive one.
Right.
And I was tempted to skip over the chapter because it talks a lot about it. But I thought there must be something in this chapter. And sure enough, I noticed that in Greek, there's a particular Greek word that Paul picks up and mentions 7 different times in this chapter. That Greek word is oikodome, which means edification. And he uses that term frequently to refer to the purpose of everything that you're doing. And that if you're doing something that doesn't edify, then stop doing it. Speaking in tongues being the perfect example. Because if somebody doesn't understand what you're saying, they are not edified by it, therefore you shouldn't do it. The point of everything we do in the assembly, says Paul, is to build up one another. Now you can have speaking in tongues, but only if somebody can interpret it, because then they are edified. So, but the thing that hit me as I'm reading through this thing, so Paul's repeatedly talking about the purpose of everything we do to be edifying one another. And I thought, where's worship? Because I thought we had worship services. I thought that we had our 5 acts of worship, as the Church of Christ was known for at the time.
Yep.
I thought that everything we did had to be acceptable worship. I thought that we opened worship with this, and then we closed worship with something else, and then we, all this worship language that we had back in 1977, which, by the way, has only increased over the last 50 years, the use of the word worship to refer to what we were doing. The long story short was, and I believe me, it's a very long story, of finally dipping deep into the biblical text to figure out what all these Greek words mean that are translated as worship, to dig deeply into the New Testament to study how Christian assemblies were conducted, why they were conducted, the terminology that is used to describe what they did in these first century Christian assemblies. And the long and short of it is our language, our worship language, worship services, worship this, worship that, is, in fact, foreign to New Testament Christianity. They would wonder, what in the world are you people doing? Our worship language is that different. But their language was build up one another. Their language was one another. There's a lot of one anothering going on in the first century assemblies, whether they're teaching one another, encouraging one another, edifying one another, building up one another, praying for one another, forgiving one another, comforting one another. It goes on and on and on and on with all that. But our modern assemblies, in whatever church, is largely not a one anothering gathering, and it is all done for the worship of God, and yet it's not being done to build up one another. And there's a whole lot of things that are missing as I've studied this over 50 years. And I finally, in the year 2016, Mark, I went back to school to get a PhD, because this topic never left me. It had been bothering me all these years, and I've been doing more and more study all the years. And finally, I decided to take this topic to a PhD dissertation and throw all these ideas up against a PhD wall and see what sticks. I wrote several papers during my doctoral program and presented them to my fellow students, as you're required to do in these classes, to see how they responded to these ideas. And the summary of all that is, this stuff is solid. It's not just a theory. It's not just an opinion. It's not just some wacky idea that some guys come up with. Now, everything I'm saying is just thoroughly, solidly biblical. And I might also add, just to make it a little more edgy, a ton of what we do today is not thoroughly, solidly biblical. I hesitate to be outright condemning. I don't want to take that tack of it. I want to
No, I understand, yeah.
I want to point to the Scriptures and see what it has for us that might help us, because we're living in an age where a lot of people are bailing out of going to church. Church attendance is declining rapidly. America is becoming like Europe in a largely secular country. Church attendance is nowhere near what it was back in the 70s when I discovered this stuff. So we really need some inspiration from the Scriptures, and I think that's where my dissertation provides actually some help, and not just condemnation, but I'm looking for help for everybody in
you bring up something. You bring up something so true. It's not a condemnation whatsoever. What it is, it's the fact that people are dying spiritually. They're looking for something. They're wanting to be part of something. They're wanting to grow. And the model that we have, in which we operate under, it's not fulfilling that. And I think that's the whole purpose of that ecclesia, that koinonia, where we're supposed to be together. And so I think what you're doing is bringing up something that really impacts the spiritual growth of people, and people really need to know that.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't realize the extent of the dissatisfaction with church services until I started to post my videos online, which was now about almost 3 years ago. In 2022, after I got my PhD, I did a series of 7 one-hour videos and posted them online, thinking somebody ought to look at this. And I'd been pleased if 1,000 people would have seen them. But now, Mark, I just crossed 900,000 views from 110 countries around the world. And I'm getting feedback, emails, comments from all these countries, all these continents throughout the world. People have been extremely dissatisfied with the status quo of what church services have become, not just in Protestant churches. I mean, there's long been dissatisfaction with the way Catholics and Orthodox churches have been doing it. There's also great dissatisfaction with all this hoopla of the evangelical churches and the mega churches and the big concerts and the lights, camera, and action going on, and people prancing around up on stage with the silver microphone and the tennis shoes and the
Yes.
get up that goes along with the whole mod thinking. But people are seeing through that, and they're still asking, what are you doing, people? What are you doing? Is this just a big show? Anyway, I'm finding this true in Costa Rica. I'm finding this true in South Africa, in Europe, in China. I'm getting response. Australia, New Zealand, all over the place. People are responding to me, saying that I'm onto something here, and it's not just me. This actually, the New Testament is onto something a long time ago, but we have missed the boat. We've been following traditions that have come to us without questioning whether indeed they are in concert with what was being done in the first century.
So, I found some statistics I thought were very interesting. Well, not really statistics, but some of the reasons why people were frustrated with what goes on in church. And one of them, and you've mentioned already some of these, but that an overly performative worship services. Others were a lack of depth or substance in what they see. Barriers, I like this one, some of the barriers from what took place from COVID now to where you have technology and people are online and they're doing church online because they're doing something they feel they have to do. I have to sit in front of a television set and watch the service. If not, God is not pleased with me because I have not technically attended worship service. And another one was this emotional disconnect. And so what you are experiencing is people who are generally dissatisfied with what has been happening. And you've opened a door for them to say, hey, here's an individual, here's Tom, who can express this in a way to an audience in which I've never been able to do. So comment a little bit more about that. Talk about how some of the comments you're getting from some of the people, does that match with some of the things I've mentioned?
Yes, it does. You've put your finger on a reaction that I'm getting. People are really gratified that here's a guy who got so deeply into this that he did a doctoral dissertation and went through an entire PhD program. And this is a fully accredited PhD program. This is not a mail by order PhD. This is the hard work. I was in school for 6 years, just in the doctoral work, for 6 years, going through tons of work. The PhD dissertation itself was about 300 pages with about 1,000 footnotes, and and I worked on this, unlike a lot of other people, I worked on this full time because I waited till the end of my career to start the PhD program so I could devote full time to it. Most guys doing their PhDs are doing it while they have a full-time job and trying to get it done on evenings and weekends. But I did this probably 60 hours a week for over 2 years, working on this topic to verify every jot and tittle, every sentence, every paragraph of this thing, and finding out new stuff all along the way. So, yeah, people are saying, finally, somebody is looked into this in great depth and is coming to the same place I've been for a long time, realizing that church isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. And he's helping to explain why I find it so empty. So that's what I get.
Well, why or what is church supposed to be doing then? We've talked about the issues. What should church be doing?
Well, first century stuff. This word one another, and it is one word in Greek. It's alelon. It's not two words, but that sort of helps. This word appears time and time again in the New Testament. The first century gatherings were connected. They were talking to one another. It's not just one person that you hired this guy and you paid him off so they could stand up there and talk for 40 minutes and yell at us for a while and make us feel guilty for a while, and then at least we know we got our money's worth. And then have also pay this worship leader, to go up there and prance around with the silver microphone and make everybody think, wow, this is a great rock concert here. And they're raising their hands and they're squinting their eyes as if they're really deep in worship, whatever that is. But there's something missing to all that. In the first century church, the music aspect was probably very minor. I have no doubt that in many first century assemblies it was non-existent. Just simply because, music today for us, we have radios, we have MP3s, we have the internet. Music can flow in our ears through earbuds 24/7. Not so in the first century. There's not that many instruments going around, people getting involved in all that. So the music is just a minor part. It's there, nothing wrong with it, But we've overblown it to where it's now this sensual concert where people are getting more excited about the sensual aspects of music instead of the spiritual aspect of the message and the lyrics and the words that are there that are intended to really build us up. You know, in the New Testament, Colossians 3:16 and Ephesians 5:19 are often cited about music, and great verses, but they talk about teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. So the process of the singing was a teaching thing of one another, not just a concert thing going on or all of us getting excited about our 4-part harmony or whatever it is you might have in an a cappella situation, but rather we're speaking to one another. We're building up one another through the process. But the music thing is really a minor issue. The bigger issue that's lacking, that was there in the first century church, was multiple speakers, multiple people participating, if not most of the people in attendance. Now, we also have to then put ourselves in the context of first century, which is primarily a house church. We tend to think, oh, first century church, oh yeah, they had a church building and they had a tall steeple and they had these stained glass windows and they had rows and rows and rows of pews and they had a pulpit up front with a big cross behind it, and no, they didn't. None of that. None of that. Zero. Right. They're in a house. They're in a small gathering. They're probably sitting around looking at each other, maybe on couches or whatever their version of that was. And there's probably the aroma of cooked food wafting in from the kitchen because there's going to be a meal afterward. They're one anothering. Everybody's equal. There's no platform in the corner where somebody's going to stand up there and wear some sacred robes and swing incense and ring bells and stuff and have a tall hat or something as if he's more special than anybody else. No. We're all together in this. We're one anothering. We're not letting one guy do it all for us. And then we're building up one another. We all have a role in that process. Love becomes a paramount attitude that binds everything together in that kind of assembly. Because when you have multiple people talking, you may not necessarily agree with what Ethel is saying over there or with James is saying over here. And there's going to be some exchange where somebody's going to say, I don't understand that. I tend to disagree with what you're saying. But it's in that process, in that messiness, that they correct one another, they admonish one another, and growth happens through that process. I find that if people don't have the opportunity to talk, they really don't have the opportunity to grow. We think that by having some inspirational, powerful orator standing behind a big box in the front, by yelling and screaming loudly, that somehow we're all going to grow. We might get excited for a few minutes, but we'll pretty much have forgotten the message by the time we get in our car out in the parking lot. But if we're actually engaging with one another in these gatherings, these small gatherings, and talking to one another and reflecting on the topic, whatever it is, where we're absorbing the topic and engaging with the word, the scripture, or whatever it is we're talking about, then growth takes place. We learn where we might be wrong on something. We learn where we might be right. We learn where we need to be getting better and progressing in the future instead of just hearing something and saying, yeah, amen, brother, way to go, preacher, and then walking out. Growth is what's missing.
It becomes an ego trip, I think, for many. I know even myself, when I was pulpit minister, it was about getting up there and what can I teach to the church? What can I do? What can I impart? And while those things are important, and they are important, the temptation is to know that I'm the one up here imparting knowledge to the people who are sitting in the mere pews, And it's easy, and I think many times that's what many preachers have done, many churches in general. There's a couple of things running through my mind. The first one is well, throw this one out first. But a friend of mine said something very interesting. He wonders how the dynamic of church would be if you were to take the praise and worship band and put them in the back of the building and have everybody face forward. Wonder how many people would be wanting to be members of the praise and worship team then. And I thought that was very true. That might be a pretty good idea. But when you were describing all this, one of the things that came to my mind is when Jesus says, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail, will not withstand. The hell will not be able to stand against us." But the part about building the church, and I've recently looked at that more about where God is taking the church and building it. It's building, and if we are the church, then Christ is building us. He's building us to be strong members that can take on the world and the challenges that they face. So those are the things I think that are important about building, because I think we've turned our churches into bureaucracies is what we've basically done, where we have a CEO. In fact, many churches are even set up like that. The preacher is the CEO, board of directors, and we're the employees who go do our thing.
Yep, very much so. But you're right, in the New Testament you see this, it's construction language, building the church. And the word oikodome that I mentioned, edification. You see the word edifice in there. It is building up is another way to translate that word. The idea in first century Christianity was that people are to be growing, to be constructing stronger buildings among themselves. They're to be strengthening and getting better within themselves, so that they might eventually become a teacher. They might be elevated to some more significant roles in communication within the body of Christ. It's not as just so you just come in as a babe in Christ and then you die and you go to heaven. But the whole process all along was that God expects us to be maturing. Like Paul, it's in Colossians 1, verse 28. He says his goal is to present every person mature in Christ. All of his letters were toward correcting people and pushing them on to greater levels of maturity and greater levels of spirituality, if you will. That's where we should be going with ourselves, but it's just not getting done.
Instead, it's become kind of, we go into a building and stare at the back of someone's head for an hour and a half, and we've done the Lord's work. Well, how have we gotten to this point? What shift do you think took place in the early stages? Maybe in the early Middle Ages, around the time of the Roman Empire. Maybe when did this take place, and what did it look like?
Yeah, along my years of research, one of the more helpful discoveries was when, I knew that the word worship is never used in the New Testament to describe what Christians did when they got together. Okay, that's interesting right there. So I then wanted to know, well then, when did this word worship begin to be used and applied to what Christians are doing in their gatherings? In other words, when did Christians start having worship services? When did they call it that? When did they call it a service? When did they call it worship? When did this start and why? And so I started to dig deep into 2nd century Christian literature, 3rd century Christian literature, 4th century Christian literature. And then finally the breadcrumbs began to reveal themselves. And it starts, I'll try to do this briefly. This goes on, this is a whole hour, by the way. This is video number 6.
Hey, I think it's very, if anybody wants to, they can, that just run with it, my friend.
Well, I have 7 videos. This is video number 6. It goes for an hour. But let's see if I can do this in 2 minutes or less, Mark. Somewhere around even the beginning of the 2nd century, some Christians started to view the Lord's Supper as a sacrifice that we offer to God. Now, that's strange to Protestant ears. It's not strange to Catholic ears, but it is strange to first century New Testament years. The the Lord's Supper represented Jesus' sacrifice for us. It is not a sacrifice that we offer to God in order to get forgiveness. But in time, that sacrifice, that idea of Lord's Supper as sacrifice, began to grow. It wasn't there throughout in the beginning of the 2nd century, but the seeds are being planted. And then the second thing that starts to happen after that seed is planted is the table upon which the Lord's Supper sat began to be viewed as an altar. Because, on every street corner virtually in ancient cities throughout the Mediterranean basin in the 1st and 2nd centuries was a temple. Not a Jewish temple. There was only one of those, and that was in Jerusalem until the year AD 70 when it was destroyed. But Jews were familiar with what temples do. They have a sacrifice, and it sits on an altar. That's where you slaughter the sacrifice, and the blood of the sacrifice is on the altar of sacrifice. So this idea of an altar begins to develop. And then, by the middle of the 3rd century, Christians are starting to use extensively the language of priest to refer to the guy who is presiding over that table upon which sits the sacrifice. And then the next step that happens in the 4th century, when Christians started to build magnificent buildings with the Constantinian money, both the Constantinian imperial money for government funds as well as Constantine's personal funding to build these things. And they started to build these lavish buildings, which they never had up to that point, never had them. Then they started to view that building as a temple. So now, this 4-step process, they had a sacrifice, which was the Lord's Supper. They sat it on a table, which they called an altar. They had priests presiding over all that and gaining in their power and authority. And then the building in which all this took place began to be viewed as a temple. What had essentially happened was Christians by the 4th century had resurrected Jewish ideas of offering a sacrifice at this holy place, presided over by the holy guys, the priests, on this altar of sacrifice, and they needed to go through these ritual processes in order to receive forgiveness week after week. I suggest that even the most conservative Protestant church among us today in the 21st century still has elements of that thinking in their system. We still have definitely. A lot of churches still have altars. And, I'm not saying you're going to go to hell because you have an altar, but what are the whole ideas that's going along with all this? So a lot of churches still call their ministers priests. I mean, with a capital P, and it's this is still out there extensively. A lot of different denominations regard their church buildings as sacred buildings, sacred space. All of those concepts which were absent in 1st century Christianity are now alive and well throughout Christianity to varying degrees and in varying forms. And what's gotten lost in the process was one anothering and edification.
Right.
The building up of one another, the respecting of one another as being sources of the Holy Spirit, sources of inspiration and wisdom, and yet now we all look to one person as having all of that holiness and wisdom to dispense for all of us. And they get the big head. I get it. I've been there. You've been there. Tons of ministers have been there, and we knew when we're going through that. We knew I'm no better than anybody else here. We knew that.
Exactly, yeah.
You generally didn't expose that detail too often. But even the very idea, but we're just doing our job. We're paid to deliver this 40-minute sermon or 20 or whatever it is in your particular church culture. We're just doing what they expect, and everybody else is just sitting back there and criticizing it, of course. That's their job. Somebody's got to do it. But in the process, the only person really who does get edified and built up is in fact the preacher dude who has to go through that enormous work of study and internalizing these ideas to the point where they can share it with others, as they do during their sermon from the pulpit on Sunday. But this is all tradition that we're now following today, and I would say it's errant tradition, ERRANT. It's gone wrong, and what we're losing in the process are those two things of one anothering and edification of the people. There's more that's being missed than that, but that's a good focus.
Right. One of the things I'm starting to see, and there seems to be, and maybe it's just the way that it's being marketed and sold, there seems to be a return to orthodoxy. And what I mean by orthodoxy is Catholicism and the Orthodox Church. There seems to be, and I get it. I've traveled to Europe quite often, and I enjoy staying at those monasteries. In fact, I've been to a couple of them where I've spent for 4 or 5 days, where it's very quiet, it's very nice. I mean, the Gregorian chants are beautiful and so forth. But I can see the temptation for somebody to be drawn into that because they feel they're part of something big, but they're an insignificant part of that something big. Whereas the New Testament model is, no, you're part of it. You are part of that edification. That brother is relying on you. That sister is relying on you. That everybody's relying on each other to build. So what are your thoughts? Why do you think people are returning more toward that orthodoxy and Catholicism?
Yeah, there's been a trend. You'll see here of evangelicals or conservative Christians leaving their Protestantism and going to a Catholic church or a Orthodox church. There's a couple of misnomers about all this. First off, everybody needs to know that the Orthodox Church is losing people like crazy. The Catholic Church is losing people like crazy. The Protestant Church is losing people like crazy. Evangelicals, Pentecostals, they're all losing people like crazy. Yet you have some of this, I wouldn't call it sheep stealing, of sheep from one group migrating over to another group. Yeah. But why are they doing it? There's been some studies that have tried to analyze why you're seeing some people who would normally have been rather conservative, Protestant-minded people, but now finding finding a home in an Orthodox setting or a Catholic setting. And it appears that it's going to vary from one person to the next, but some of the common draws for them is the perception that they're now being drawn into something ancient, something more deeply grounded, something with great, rich history. I get that, but in reality, they're probably jumping back only to the 4th century, and they haven't gone all the way back to the 1st century, which is the big problem, because by the 4th century, a ton of stuff had gone wrong, as I'd already outlined with this sacrifice, altar, priest, and temple idea, which were well ingrained by the 4th century, and that's really what they're going to. But I understand that richness, but we also need to understand why they're leaving their evangelical moorings and going off to this more liturgical experience. A lot of evangelicals are seeing the senselessness and the emptiness of this whole showmanship thing that's going on with the overemphasis on worship and the overemphasis on music and the lights, camera, and action, and the fog machines and
roller coasters, zip lines, you name
it. Even you have wrestling matches going on with this crazy stuff going on, but it's all a show, and people are saying, "What are you people doing?" Now, you can go along with it for as long as you want to go along with it, but pretty soon people are going to say, What are we doing? Why am I here? Am I just here? I could be watching this on TV, on ESPN, can I? Or something. But what's missing, though, is people are not building relationships with one another. And Mark, people are missing good relationships with, and they're getting more relationship from their smartphone than they are through these little surface relationships we have with people in the foyer at church, where you might get a free cup of coffee and some chatting about last week's Bear game and such. But where's the depth? Where's the real struggle that people are going through, that all of us are going through? And where are we talking about this? And where should we be going as committed Christians in this bizarre culture that we live in now? That's what people are asking. And I don't think they're finding the answers in the Orthodox experience or the Catholic experience. Some are finding something, but I think you need to look back more than the 4th century. Let's go back to the 1st century
To the first, yes.
and see some really good things there. And this is not to, by the way, this does not imply that the 1st century church had it all together, because they were screwed up too. And that's why Paul wrote all his letters, because all these
those letters
people
were exactly.
they're all messed up. But at least you have an apostolic presence that is offering some correctives to getting things on the right track. And that's what we need to be listening to get ourselves on the right track as well.
And when I read the New Testament, and this took me a long time to get to it, and it's the light bulb moment that really kind of changed my view, even while I was a pulpit minister, and it still does today, is the idea of what is the purpose of Christianity, as we call it. Okay, I use that word loosely because so many things that are attached to it, but what is the purpose? What is the message? And the message is not about when you die, you get to go to heaven. It's about, and of course that is part of it. Don't misunderstand me. But it's the development. Jesus said in John 10:10, I've come to give you life and that you may have it more abundant, an abundant life, a life of the Spirit. And he talks about the Spirit ushering in, and the whole message is about the Spirit coming in to change us into becoming like Christ, to have that mind of Christ, to become like Him. And in order to do that, we have to have that closeness, and we have to edify and build each other up. If not, we're left with a religion is what we're left with. And I think that's one of the greatest problems we're seeing today, is the lack of understanding of the spiritual life. And I believe that's at least my opinion. Your thoughts?
Oh, I'm with you on this, Mark. This is huge. As I cited Colossians 1:28, Paul's goal was to present every person mature in Christ, and your illustrations are right on target there. To have life and have it more abundantly. God has planted His Spirit. He's basically planted Himself within us right now. That's not just so we can coast till we finally get to go to heaven. We're supposed to be meaning something to other people, giving ourselves for other people, building up one another. It's all this one anothering again. There's so many scriptures in the New Testament that talk about the very purpose of our existence is for good works, is for doing good deeds for other people, loving one another, loving our community, helping one another, helping our neighbors. This is why we are here. It's not just to be going to church so that we can check the button, check off the list of, we got that done this week. Now we can go back. Yeah, I'll stop cussing more and I'll quit smoking cigarettes. But we're supposed to be beyond that. Come on, we should be growing and becoming wiser, more compassionate, more patient, more considerate, more understanding. The Holy Spirit should really be taking. These are the gifts of the Spirit that are talked about so many times in the New Testament, and yet we just sort of pass over those things. Over time, your 20-year-old Christian should be a whole lot better by the time he's a 30-year-old Christian. And by the time they're a 60-year-old Christian.
And not just in head knowledge.
No. As Paul said in 1 Corinthians 8:1, he said, knowledge puffs up.
Puffs up.
But love builds up. And by the way, that's that word edification again, oikodome. It's a loving personality, a loving individual who cares about others and who can show it. And hopefully by the time you're 60 or 70, it's obvious to people, and people gravitate to that, and they want to sit and listen to the wisdom that spouts forth from somebody who shows that kind of growth in their spiritual life. And the only way to get there is not by sitting in a pew week after week, listen to somebody yell at you. It's through engaging with one another in these gatherings where we grow together and encourage one another. That famous verse that we've all cited, Mark, Hebrews 10:24 and 25, which shames people into not going to church. You remember that?
Not going to church.
Well, yes. What that verse actually says, the positive admonition there is to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, but encouraging one another. Well, that's the things that should be happening when we get together, stirring up one another to love and to doing good things, and then encouraging one another. If you do that every week, and if you know that your job when you get together with your gathering every week is to build up other people and to be edified in that gathering, I suggest you are going to grow. You can't help but grow in that kind of environment. But if you just simply go into a holy church building and you sit down in the sacred pew in front of the holy man up there who's spouting off these wonderful words of wisdom, you'll get something out of that, I suppose, but you're probably going to forget it by the time you get to your car, as I said earlier.
Well, we've talked about it at the 40,000-foot view. Let's bring it down here to ground level. How does that look like in a gathering? We talk about edifying. We talk about building up. I understand it's the Spirit that changes us, but the Father uses the Spirit and uses other people as well. What are some of maybe the specifics in a gathering that a person can do to uplift and build someone up?
Yeah. First of all, you got to be in a gathering that allows you to talk.
Exactly.
And if you're not there, forget about it. It's not going to happen. Maybe you have to wait till you get in the foyer afterwards and exchanged a few pleasantries before you head to the car. But now, what really, if you are, and by the way, you can go to church all you want, but unless you're in a small group, you're not going to grow. So if the question is, Mark, if you're in a small group, whether it's in a house or wherever it is, how can you then participate in this growth process? Well, I think the organization of that gathering is wisely, I think, organized around questions. And in other words, you're wisely organized around the teaching methods of Jesus of Nazareth, when he would walk and talk with the disciples, and he would ask them questions. Who do men say that I am? And then they would ask him questions, and he would come back, and they would ask more questions, and they would be wrong about something, and he'd have to. But it's a question. I've been teaching small groups for almost 50 years, and I've found that the best experience in that small group happens when I have crafted one good question to start off the meeting. And it's a question that usually has some interaction with some scripture. It's a question that doesn't just probe for head knowledge. It's a question that probes to your spirit, to who you are and your emotions and your behavior not other people's behavior. We can all get together and complain about other people's behavior, but what are you doing?
Exactly.
But a question that drills down to that kind of important issue then begins to spawn a discussion that everybody can participate in, that everyone should participate in as much as possible, and then we begin to grow through that process. Is that there's more to it than that, but does that make sense?
Of course. Yeah, it makes sense. It is relational. We held Bible studies gatherings, Bible studies in our house.
Yeah.
But this was a number of years ago when we lived in Southeast Texas, and I remember a little house, 1,500 square foot. We had 50 people crammed in there because people were hungry for that. They wanted to be part of something, and it, when you mentioned what you just mentioned, it brought back that memory of when you ask a pointed question that challenges not their thinking, but maybe their view, their worldview, or how they're acting, and their thinking too, I guess, it really starts bringing out something that's really deep into them, and somebody else will chime in about what's happened to them, and it feeds off each other into edifying, not a feeding frenzy of tearing each other down or just an emotional hype, but it's about each other sharing, and that person grows from that. And you could see the joy in people's lives. And I think that's where we need to go with it. And that leads me to my next question is, do you think that this is going to be the upcoming, I hate to use the word model. There's always a church model somewhere. Do this model for 10 years, and we'll try to work that. But do you think that is what's going to take place eventually as we see the world becoming more anti-church or anti-Christian?
Oh, yeah. I hate to be pessimistic, but I've lived in this same community here basically all my life. I went away to school for several years, but I eventually came back, and I've been doing church attendance studies here in my local community for 40 years, more than 40 years, where actually my studies have gotten a head count from every church in town, and that's over 30 churches. I've been fortunate to have all the ministers in town cooperate with me and give me their numbers confidentially. Even though it's sometimes been a very embarrassing sort of number. But I can track how desperate the situation is. A church attendance in my town, even though the population is the same, the church attendance has dropped by 60% over that period of time. And it's continuing. It's been on a downward trajectory. It's not going up and down like this. It's just going down. It's not good, folks. And now we're getting to the point where most of the churches in town have got like 50 or fewer people left. And sometimes it's 40 or fewer people. And the real issue is the number of those 40 people who are either bald or gray-headed and headed for the grave within 20 years, if not less. Now, what I'm saying is, as soon as, the majority of the people who are left in these little bitty churches of 40 people are dead, which is either 10 or 20 years from now, that church will not be able to sustain itself, will not be able to pay for it to have a new roof, will not be able to pay to have a minister do all the stuff for them. They're going to have to give it up, close the doors, and sell the church to a local brewery. I mentioned that because my wife and I, in all full confession, we went to a place in a town about 30 miles from here that had a beautiful Episcopalian church building that went back to the 1800s, and it's now a magnificent brewery. Yeah, the big old tanks of where they're brewing beer is up there in the holy place of the sanctuary now, and people love it.
Near the altar.
Yeah, it is, my goodness. But you talk about the future. Regardless of whether church buildings are used for a brewery or for apartment buildings or whatever they are, the future is grim. Some have said that house churches are the future. I'm not sure that's true, but there's some sense to that. I think the only future for personal growth. Let's put it, the only future for personal growth as a Christian happens in small groups. And if our goal is to grow people, not just to rack up numbers, because you can rack up numbers with a variety of shtick, that'll attract people. But what really is the issue is getting better, growing spiritually, having life abundantly, growing wiser, and all that. If that's our goal, it's going to happen in small groups. And if you have a small group that sits inside a $4 billion cathedral that can seat 3,000 people, that's fine. At least it's a small group. They're inspiring the surroundings, but it's in that small group where people can talk and build up one another. That's where growth takes place. And that's where I think there is a future. As long as people are genuinely developing as Christians, then there's going to be a generation that looks at that and says, what do those people got? I want that. Yeah. And they're going to start to remember their youth 50 years ago when they grew up in church, and some of those great songs are some of the principles of Jesus dying for us that's going to have a meaning to them, and then maybe things will turn around. But right now that's just theory for me in my mind.
Well, we'll have to see where it goes with it. I get the feeling sometimes that it's going to go more, and when I say underground, I'm not talking necessarily about some kind of great persecution, not that it couldn't happen, of course, and it very well could, but I think that's where it's going to be, because I think that is where people are truly searching. While some may go to a church, it's going to be that group of people who speak with each other, who discuss, who question each other, and are not afraid to discuss and question things and have that growth. But not only that relationship that comes with it, because one of the things I see that's lacking is there are many people who go to church, but they don't know anybody. They don't know anybody there, and there's no one near them to say, hey, Mark, why are you behaving this way? You're doing things you shouldn't be doing. You're acting in a way that is not is not Christ-like. Now let me help you to become more Christ-like. And I think people yearn for that. They do, but there's no relationship building, so therefore there's no growth taking place. And that's what I'm hoping happens. Is maybe it's a dream that you and I have, but I think that's my thinking at least.
We're talking online, you and me right now. You're in Texas, I'm in Illinois. I'm one thing I didn't know about or appreciate is the fact that there's a bunch of people who are getting together via Zoom or some sort of online format, and they're having these online meetings, Christians, and sometimes they're doing it multiple times a week, and they'll live in different parts of the country, but it's through this frank and open exchange like you and I are having now, right. Where we're learning from one another, we're respecting one another, we're listening, we're being compassionate, and we're growing through the process. So yes, it's better when you're in person, but I'm seeing that that's another thing that's starting to happen that modern technology is helping us with. I don't know how else to put that. There was it last week? I think I was in a group of 5 Church of Christ ministers, Mark, and I think 4 of them were black, 1 of them was white, but these guys get together frequently via Zoom, and they just go at it that way. And the love that was obvious between these folks was inspiring. And I've had several of these discussions where people have invited me into their group over the last 6 months. And just to see the love that exists between these people, the frankness, they're all familiar with each other's weaknesses, and sometimes they'll joke about it, and then they'll be encouraging one another. But it's relationships. Relationships is what, through growth, is how growth takes place. Yep, you get it.
Yep. Well, it's been fantastic. We've been talking about a lot of things, but what's the next step for Tom? Where are you going next with this?
Yeah, well, I've known for more than 40 years Mark, frankly, not Frank Markley.
Frankly,
I've known that this topic is enormous. I've known that this topic is revolutionary. It's just biblical. I mean, gee whiz, it's nothing really brilliant about it, but it's right there. Everybody's Bible's got this stuff. But I've known that it has to get out. And it wasn't until I floated these videos back now to some years ago. And really, those videos didn't take off until last August. Now about, 9 months ago. It just exploded. And now it's got all these views. So I don't know what or how, but for me, I just realized I need to keep on keeping on in getting the message out, either through these podcasts like with you, or putting out some of my own. But I also want to get out a book. There's been a lot of people been clamoring to me for a book that has this stuff. And I think that probably is the next progression of getting information out. Because I'm 72 years old, Mark. I'm not going to be around forever. There needs to be something left behind so that people can read about this and start to build off of it, because really the principles are in the New Testament. My dissertation covers a lot of this stuff. I've thought about publishing my dissertation, but if you've ever read a doctoral dissertation, it'll put you to sleep within a page and a half.
I got you. I understand.
It's just too technical. But there's a lot of very informative and helpful stuff therein. And so that's where I'm going. I just getting the word out more and more frequently. And I'm glad you asked that. There was one thing that I've started to mention is that I'm looking for speaking opportunities. I speak for free, so I'm not out to try to make money off of anything I'm doing. But if you know of a church conference somewhere, a seminary conference, or some sort of situation where they're looking for a speaker on an interesting topic, I'm putting myself out there as available for this kind of thing. I'm 72. I'm retired. My wife and I love to travel, and I'll go anywhere with this message and put my show on the road. Again, I speak for free. I do ask if you can cover my travel expenses. I really appreciate it. But that's another way to get the message out, and maybe a way I can do it personally in a way that might mean something more to other people. And
your website, people can find you at?
Yes, at tomwadsworth.com, TomWadsworth.com. Also, my YouTube channel, what has exploded. We've got now close to 40 videos available there with over about 930,000 views right now. So that's go to youtube.com/@TomWadsworth, and then you'll find my stuff. Or just go to YouTube and type in Tom Wadsworth and worship, and I think you'll probably find me in a hurry.
Well, that's fantastic. I know we could continue talking on for a long time. In fact, I'd really like to have you back again sometime to discuss more and just maybe dive in more depth into some of the other topics. But it's been fantastic and greatly appreciated. So, again, Tom, thank you for your time and blessings to you. And I'm looking forward to see that book and seeing you at some speaking engagement here nearby, and it'd be great. I'm sure there's all kinds of places. So, again, visit your website and visit Tom's website and check out the resources. I've been to it. A lot of great resources there. So, once again, Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. God bless your ministry as well. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, there you have it. Hope you've enjoyed the interview. Please subscribe, leave a comment. Would like to hear from you as to what you think about the topic of worship and the thoughts, the comments that you've heard today. Until the next time, God bless, and we'll see you in the next episode.